I now welcome Dr. Katie Hepworth from the Australasian Centre on Corporate Responsibility. Thank you for joining us. For your benefit, I'm the Chair, Senator Tony Sheldon. I am joined by Senator Ben Small and Senator Raf Ciccone. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Katie Hepworth, and I appear as the Director of Workers' Rights for the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility.
Thank you. The Australasian Centre on Corporate Responsibility has lodged submission 46 with the committee. Would you like to make any amendments or additions to that submission?
No amendments.
Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been provided to you as part of your invitation to appear. I now invite you to make a short opening statement. Please limit your remarks to 2 minutes to allow time for questions. At the conclusion of your remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions. Over to you, Dr. Hepworth.
Thanks, Tony. The Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility is an independent research and shareholder advocacy organisation. We are formed to engage Australian listed companies on ESG issues, including labour rights. A key focus of our work over the last 3 years has been on the outsourcing of work and labour. As we note in our submission, one of the most significant changes in Australian workplaces over the last few decades has been the resurgence and multiplication of indirect forms of employment, with the company's workforce now stretching beyond its direct employees to include labour hire agencies, subcontractors, service contractors, and even gig economy workers. Scholar David Wheel has coined the term fissured workplace to describe this trend. In sectors where ACCR has focused our engagement, workplace fissuring is directly correlated to significant reductions of job security and has introduced clear challenges to the provision of decent work now, with repercussions for workers' dignity and retirement well into the future. Furthermore, and significantly for ACCR, the risks of fissuring go beyond individual workers to the whole of companies and the economy. Research shows that indirect employment relationships can increase a company's exposure to a range of business risks, including poorer OH&S outcomes, increased possibility of involvement in modern slavery and wage theft, lower levels of worker engagement, loss of human capital, and reduced training and skills acquisition. This has long-term negative implications for long-term value creation for companies and their investors, and is a particular risk for super funds. In 2020 and 2021, we published major research reports that detailed these risks and analysed whether company reporting is sufficient for investors to understand and engage companies on their workforce strategies and its risks. We found that in a majority of cases, company reporting was lacking and acted as an impediment to investor engagement. This is even in cases where indirect workers make up a majority of the workforce. So specifically, less than half the companies we surveyed publicly report on the total number of contractors and labour hire workers in their workforce, and less than half provide disaggregated OH&S data for this workforce. Even where companies do provide this data, it's unclear whether the data captures the entirety of the workforce due to an absence of descriptions or definitions of the types of workers they're including. In other words, it's impossible to deduce if and how companies are using labour hire and contract workers in their operations, and it's really difficult to make useful comparisons between companies. I want to end by stressing that while we're looking at reporting and the submissions that we've made, good reporting does not necessarily equate to good practices. There are a number of instances where companies with leading reporting evidence significant risks in their operations due to their use of indirect labour, such as labour hire and contracting. Thank you.
Good, thanks very much for that. And throughout this inquiry, we've heard a lot about workers engaged through labour hire, external contracting and outsourcing. You submitted a report to this inquiry which examined how ASX 100 companies are reporting and taking responsibility for conditions for these workers. How are our largest companies performing overall?
So what we're seeing is there's been a massive shift in the use of labour hire and contracting by major companies. We've had, features by the mining industry in front of the Commission earlier in this, and we're seeing in some of that, this outsourced labour is now a majority of the workforce. We're seeing that the use of labour hire and contracting is now going beyond a use of seasonal fluctuations or just used for skilled labour, and it's starting to kind of replace core employee workforces. The problem is that we don't have a true understanding of the scale of this shift by ASX companies because the reporting just isn't there. We've had to kind of triangulate information by speaking to regulators, by speaking to companies, speaking to unions to try and get a picture of the extent of this workforce. Just to give a picture of that, when we spoke to the Queensland Mining Inspectorate, on some Queensland coal mines, we now have only a few people who are directly employed by companies, with the majority of workers engaged through external agencies. What we have said is that irrespective of the reasons that companies are using it, there are huge risks involved in this shift. And it is impossible, based on the reporting that we have analysed, for investors to get a clear picture of the risks that companies are facing when they're shifting to this workforce model.
Thank you. We've been focusing today on horticulture and that supply chain. You've been urging Coles and Woolies to take greater responsibility for their horticulture supply chain for a number of years. How are they doing?
So what we've seen is we've seen greater degrees of mapping, but we're not seeing them really kicking out non-compliant labour hire providers and non-compliant suppliers. So one of the issues that we raised with Coles and Woolworths, is that the major risks in their supply chain were due to the complexity of those supply chains, the explosion of labour hire and dodgy labour hire providers in those supply chains, which really led to a lack of transparency on those supply chains. We've seen that there is an over-reliance on labour hire licensing at a state level. The problem is unless Woolworths and Coles take steps to get rid of dodgy labour hire providers and actually implement the policies that they have put in place, we're going to see this continue. They have the power in the supply chain to really affect change with their suppliers. And if they don't, the risk to labour hire agencies and their farms is greater. They lose more money from a loss of contract by Coles than they do from being found out by the Ombudsman.
So thank you for that. Later this week, we have Qantas appearing. The federal court ruled in July that they had acted illegally when they outsourced 2,000 ground handling jobs last year. Where Qantas is breaking the law to attack its own workforce, is that a situation where their investors should be intervening and asking serious questions about their management?
Yes, I believe it is. And we engaged investors very early on in this, in the dispute, and it really early days in the court case, because we believe that this outsourcing represented significant risks because of the lack of control of the workforce. And we're particularly concerned that Qantas was outsourcing responsibility for this cohort and outsourcing, I guess, tasks that involved very skilled labour to external entities. The other thing we were concerned at is, I guess, the leading contractors that they were looking at who had a reputation for underpayment and poor working conditions on the site, which introduced a new cohort of risks in terms of management of the workforce for investors. I want to stress too is that given, I guess, the findings of the court case and the controversy around the outsourcing, I think it's significant that Qantas's reporting on its whole workforce, and particularly its contracting workforce, is very, very poor. It's some of the poorest reporting that we've seen of all of the companies, providing only an FTE number, which means that investors just cannot get a picture of what this shift will mean in terms of that workforce.
Thank you. And I'll now go to Senator Small.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your time this morning. I'm curious in terms of the views you've just offered there around the risks faced in the operations of a company and indeed the appropriateness of various contractors to perform that work. I guess, why does the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility consider itself better placed to make those sorts of judgments than the executives or indeed the board of directors of a particular company?
So ACCR's role is to analyse investment risk for companies. And so what we do is to highlight risk to investors and where information is lacking, and really try to pinpoint the types of questions that investors should be asking when they speak to companies, and looking at where, they might not be looking at long-term value over short-term value. What we try to do with investors is to provide the investment sector with the tools to properly analyse the decision by companies to ensure that it takes into account the full spectrum of issues. I guess what we highlight is sometimes there are really short-term decisions that are made, and what we want to make sure is that it's really pulled out, and that investors have the full tools available to them to understand what the long-term implications. As we highlight in, I guess, all the reporting that we've done on labour hire, I think there is often a short-termism in the way that this engagement happens, and that often the kind of long-term implications of a shift to an outsourced workforce are downplayed. The thing is, it's really, really clear in the academic literature that you can't afford to downplay this downplay this shift.
So, but you can't suggest that you offer tools to allow shareholders to form an opinion at the same time as you are articulating a particular view on the matter. That's an incompatible statement.
We take the publicly available information and present it to investors. And I would say that, it's not just my opinion. The federal court has also found, and I understand that this is under appeal at the moment. So as Tony mentioned, but, and I would also say that the evidence is clear out there around some of the contractors that appeared. What we want to do is say that if there is cost-cutting happening on those contracts...
You're right, this is obviously a matter under appeal. So we need to be very careful about talking around the specific matter that's been referred to. My question was couched quite broadly. Why does the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility feel that it is better placed to make assessments on these matters than the board of directors or executives? Because you've gone well beyond providing shareholders with a tool, and you are actually making very specific statements around the suitability of a particular operating model or indeed contractors to perform work.
Yes, and the information that we've provided is the same information that we provided to investors about different companies that allowed them to ask the questions, which we've done this similarly on other contractors. And we would provide this information just to allow investors to make those decisions.
So where investors make the decision to buy shares at increasing prices, isn't that an endorsement of the company's strategic direction and vision?
It may be, yes, but what we're saying is that what we're looking at is a longer-term performance of companies, and that investors are needing to look at this holistically. Indeed.
So where the share price of Qantas, for instance, has been one of the better performing stocks on the ASX 200. If we take a 5-odd year horizon going from trading between $2.50 and $4 and reaching a peak of just shy of $7.50 before the onset of COVID-19, and having recovered to be trading at $5.60-ish today, that sounds like a pretty stunning endorsement of the decisions that that particular management team has taken.
I can't comment on the share price at different points in time on this, but I would say that what we're seeing though is a shift in terms of broader implications. What I'd say is that when you're actually looking at the longer term implications, when you actually have accidents that appear on site, that you might get different opinions. And so what we're trying to do is there might be short-term reasons, and we are trying to focus out on those long-term horizons.
So the long-term horizon of the strategic decisions has led to very significant shareholder growth in the wealth of the asset they hold. So it sounds to me like you're pushing an ideological agenda rather than one that's fundamentally based in the value of the company's operations.
So if we look more broadly, what I would say is that there is a risk associated, and we highlight this in our report, that research shows that overall there are large risks associated with indirect employment. There may be reasons why companies choose this model, but they actually need to have the investors need to have this information in front of them to actually be able to weigh up the proper cost benefit of the decision making that companies are making in choosing to move to an outsourced model. I would say that significantly, given the court cases that Qantas is facing, and I'm not going to go into detail, obviously, because of the appeal, that this is something that investors should be taking into account. What is that decision making that saw Qantas in front of the federal court, and why are they going ahead with that?
Thank you. It seems shareholders love it. So with that, I'll pass back to the chair.
Thanks very much, Senator Small. Senator Faruqi.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, Dr. Hepworth. In your submission, you've discussed the high risk of modern slavery in particular sectors. And I was just wondering if you could highlight some of those sectors that have the most exploited workers in the context of modern slavery.
Yeah, so ACCR has focused on domestic sectors at high risk of modern slavery. So we've already talked about horticulture, which I think is a focus of today. We've also looked quite extensively at commercial cleaning. Another sector is the meat industry, which has not been a focus for ACCR because we work on Australian listed companies and there isn't a huge exposure for Australian listed companies. So the big focus for us has been horticulture and cleaning.
And I just wanted to
Senator Faruqi, your lines, your sound's just dropped. If you could restate the question in a moment.
are they more
Sorry, Senator Faruqi, we didn't pick up. Sorry, Senator Faruqi, we didn't pick up that question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't pick up on the question.
Senator Faruqi, could you repeat your question? I know Senator Faruqi's been having some difficulties with her service this morning, so I might just, when she comes back on, I'll go back to her. But over to you, Senator Ciccone.
Look, thanks, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
Yes.
Look, I just wanted to follow on from Dr. Hepworth's early comments, I think, under some line of questioning from you, Chair, and around trying to get a sense of the problem that I guess we currently face in the economy. You mentioned that you'd sort of have to sort of cobble together information and data. I mean, what type of data would you like to see collected and by whom? How would you like to see that reported? Is there a role for government somewhere to sort of collect this data centrally?
Yeah, so our focus has been predominantly on company reporting, and what we have done is use the Global Reporting Initiative standards. So the Global Reporting Initiative, I guess, is an international standard that is meant to standardise reporting across companies to allow for better cross-company analysis and assessment of risk. Using that reporting, we analyse company reports, and what we've said is that companies need to report on whole of workforce. So at the moment, the majority of companies will only report on the numbers of direct employees in their workforce, and we want that extended to all workers that provide core business. And the term that the GRI uses is workers who are under the company's control. And so that means that they have either they work on a site that is under the control of the company, or their work is otherwise dictated by the company. Using that definition, which kind of overlaps quite significantly with some of the OH&S legislation around responsibility, I think we would actually start to get a better picture of indirect workers in ASX-listed companies, which we could use for for sector-wide analysis. I think there is a role for government, and I don't think it would be significantly higher labour, because these are already things that are reported against under OH&S laws. But what needs to happen is, I guess, clarity over who has the responsibility to report, because often the data is double reported or not reported at all because there is a dispute about whether it is the responsibility of the host company or their contractors to report on safety incidences, for example. So it's unclear. I think some clarity as well at the ABS around how numbers are collected. And I think this goes to, what workers see themselves as, and why it's difficult to get this information, is that workers do not often self-identify as labour hire or contract workers. So if they are hired through a contractor to, say, work for Coles, they'll often say that they work for Coles when they're asked by ABS and other statistical data. So we actually have a lower counting of it. So I think if that information could be clarified, we get a better picture as well.
Do you think there should be any amendments to current legislation to sort of force companies to disclose these numbers?
when we are seeing reporting changes in the US and the UK along these lines, and that's where we're starting to get better reporting, so similar to the SEC. And I think that that would be a significant improvement on company reporting at the moment, because at the moment we're not seeing standardized reporting at all, and it makes it very difficult for investors to get a picture.
Okay. And I guess in terms of the responsibilities, I mean, I take it that you'd think that companies that do outsource should still have that responsibility of the workers that work for their company, I guess, even though technically they work for a labour hire firm, they still have that responsibility. I mean, I'd just be wanting to know what else we can do and what can the government do to make sure that there is that greater accountability and transparency and ensuring that the workers, have the same rights as other workers who do work directly for the company.
So we've seen, I guess, some emergence of responsibility. So I guess OH&S law is beginning to address this question of responsibility, which says that the host company or all primary companies have a shared responsibility to that workforce. So the host company cannot outsource OH&S responsibility for workers hired through external entities. What I'd want to see is that kind of extended out to, I guess, other types of responsibilities. In our submission, we said that we wanted to see a firming up of accessorial liability provisions in line with what was recommended by the Migrant Worker Task Force, because while this indicates that companies have a responsibility, to date it has been very difficult to prosecute. And so I think it's actually about how do we actually make those laws enactable and ensure that there are provisions for that responsibility to kind of feed through. And that recognises, I guess, who is actually determining the conditions in the supply chain. So we started off with speaking about Coles and Woolworths earlier in this evidence. And I mean, what we looked at there is that in a number of cases, they do have the ability to determine working conditions in bits of their supply chain, as it has been found out in trolley collection and in their cleaning workforce by the Fair Work Ombudsman.
Thank you very much, Senator Ciccone. Senator Faruqi.
Chair, and I apologize for my very dodgy internet connection today. I'll keep the camera off in hopes that it might be a little bit better. And sorry, Dr. Hepworth as well. So I was just wanting to know, in terms of who the most exploited workers might be in the sectors which you have highlighted have a higher risk of modern slavery prevalence, and particularly migrant workers, is the risk exacerbated for them in those sectors?
Yeah, so you're right. The highest risk is to migrant workers. So in the sectors that I mentioned, horticulture and cleaning, you have a high percentage of migrant workers in those supply chains, and a high degree of workers who are often working beyond their visa conditions or without kind of work rights, either because they have refugee visas without work rights attached, or they have student visas with workplace limitations. It's those workers that either working without work rights or who have some conditions on their ability to work who are at highest risk of exploitation. And we have seen evidence, I guess repeatedly, and I'm sure you'll hear it from other people providing evidence today, of threats of deportation, et cetera, being used against migrant workers to kind of make them more compliant and to ensure that they do not kind of speak up about workplace exploitation.
And during COVID-19, as we know that, migrant workers on temporary visas were not eligible for either job seeker or job keeper, do you think this would have increased the risk of migrant workers falling into slavery-like working conditions?
Yes, it did, and this was something that was highlighted by Australian Border Force, in fact, in their advice to companies on modern slavery. So, it increased the risk because, I guess, as people become more desperate, so if they lost work, and this was the advice we provided to companies, when workers lost work and were unable to get other kinds of payments, COVID disaster payments, they needed to do something to pay the rent. So they became more vulnerable to accepting contracts that were paying below minimum wages, that where there was threats and coercions in that work. And they had less ability to say no to those kinds of contracts. So it's definitely something that Australian Border Force was calling on companies to look at here and overseas when they were doing their analysis of the supply chain. And when we were engaging with property owners about their cleaning supply chains, almost across the board, they highlighted the increased risk of modern slavery in their cleaning supply chains within Australia because of these reasons.
And then just last question from me, Dr. Hepworth. On page 6 of your submission, it says, while a number of companies have acknowledged increased modern slavery risks due to COVID-19, it is concerning that many companies have halted their auditing of high-risk supply chains during the pandemic, arguing that auditors are unable to attend work sites. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has been used as a cover by some companies to stop auditing their work sites?
I'm not sure. I think so for the international ones, they were unable to send international auditors. And I think this highlights a broader risk of a reliance on people that are coming in to audit and kind of fly in, fly out auditors rather than having expertise on the ground. I think there probably was possibilities to do it in Australia, taking into account the obvious risks to auditors and others. However, we are aware that it was very difficult to cross borders and to get into kind of regional communities. What I would like to highlight, though, is that there is an over-reliance by companies on these kinds of audits to identify risks in their supply chains. And what you actually need is what is now being called globally as worker-driven social responsibility, which is actually building up workers on each site to monitor their own work sites, similar to what we've seen at after Rana Plaza with the Bangladesh Accord, but actually really stabilising that as a kind of audit, as a replacement to auditing as it exists at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Hepworth. Your evidence been a great deal of assistance to the committee, and it will help us in our deliberations and the preparation of our final report. If you've taken questions on notice, please provide responses to the Secretariat by the 25th of October 2021, and that we now break until 12 p.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.